Welcome to the Union County Public Schools training on the North Carolina-Deborah Greenblatt Act, addressing the use of restraint, seclusion, and other behavior management techniques in public schools. The purpose of this training is to assist school staff in understanding what constitutes restraint and seclusion, and when and whether such behavior management techniques are appropriate for use with public school students to avoid inappropriate behavioral interventions that compromise students' health and safety. In 2005, the North Carolina legislature enacted the Deborah Greenblatt Act, named after Deborah Greenblatt, a North Carolina attorney who tirelessly advocated on behalf of individuals with disabilities. Disability advocates and education professionals worked together to develop a statute that now governs the use of physical restraints, mechanical restraints, seclusion, isolation, and aversive procedures with public school students. All Union County Public School employees who have direct contact with students must be provided with regular training to assist in understanding what these behavior techniques are, how to safely implement restraint and seclusion procedures, and when to identify improper uses of these techniques. Importantly, all school personnel should make every effort to use appropriate positive behavioral strategies that de-escalate dangerous behavior in order to prevent the need to use restraint and seclusion. The Deborah Greenblatt Act is adopted by the Union County School Board in School Board Policy 4-3 and is reprinted in its entirety in the elementary, middle, and high school handbooks. This law applies to school personnel, which includes employees of Union County Public Schools, and also to all contracted individuals providing educational and related services to students, such as speech therapists, physical therapists, and other service providers who work with students at school or as part of homebound services. These individuals are also subject to the requirements of the law, even if they are employed by an independent agency. One exception is the ability of law enforcement officers to exercise their law enforcement duties, which could include the use of handcuffs and seclusion to control dangerous behavior in order to maintain safety and order in the schools. Importantly, it is the policy of the state of North Carolina to promote safety and prevent harm to students and staff in school, treat students with dignity and respect, provide school staff with guidelines about what constitutes the use of reasonable force in public schools, and employ positive behavioral interventions to address student behavior in a safe manner. First, we will address the behavior management technique of physical and mechanical restraints. Both types restrict a student's freedom of movement of either the entire body or any part of the body, for example, arms, legs, or torso. A physical restraint occurs when one person uses his or her own body to restrict the free movement of all or a portion of another person's body. So, if an employee physically uses his or her own body to restrict the student's ability to move, such as by holding the student in a chair, pinning the student against a wall, sitting on the student, or physically wrapping his or her arms around the student and taking them to the floor, the employee is using a physical restraint. These are illustrations of what actions constitute a physical restraint, but are not examples of appropriate restraints. Training by certified nonviolent crisis intervention trainers will provide guidance about appropriate restraint methods. The law allows for the use of physical restraints on a student in limited situations. Remember, any restraint or seclusion technique should be used in the least restrictive manner necessary and should stop as soon as the situation requiring these techniques ends. In addition, restraints and seclusion should never restrict a child's breathing. So what are the situations when a physical restraint can lawfully be used? First, If a student has a weapon or dangerous object and the student does not respond to verbal de-escalation strategies or requests to give up the weapon, an employee can use only the amount of physical force that is reasonably necessary to take the weapon away from the student. Again, the employee should use the least restrictive measure necessary to take away the weapon or dangerous object and remove the threat. Never use prone restraints that restrict breathing, restraints to the neck that block the windpipe, and other restraints that restrict the breathing of a student. Second, school employees can use physical restraints when it is necessary to maintain order, break up a fight, and to protect the safety of others. Again, the restraint used must only involve the amount of force reasonably necessary to protect other students, employees, volunteers, and anyone else who would be in danger. As soon as the fight or other threat of harm has passed, the restraint must end. Third, the restraint of a student is also allowed when restraint is reasonably needed for the employee's self-defense. As with all uses of physical restraint, the use of force for self-defense must be the least amount necessary to still protect the employee from injury. Fourth, physical restraints can be appropriate if specifically provided for in a student's IEP, Section 504 plan, or behavior intervention plan. These plans should specify the positive behavioral interventions and supports to be used, when physical restraint is to be used, and the underlying cause, purpose, or function of these behavioral restraints for that child. It is essential that all staff members and service providers who work with a special needs student be familiar with the behavioral interventions specified in the IEP, 504 plan, and behavior plan to be able to implement the provisions consistently, appropriately, and with fidelity. These plans contain provisions that develop, alter, or maintain specific behaviors through the implementation of specified behavior management techniques. If restraint or seclusion is repeatedly being used with a student, staff should be prepared to convene a team to conduct a review of that student's IEP, behavior plan, or 504 plan to address whether the specified behavioral strategy should be modified or if further assessment of the student is required. Fifth, there are several additional circumstances specified in the Act regarding when physical restraints may be used. The Act allows employees to engage in reasonable physical intervention when needed to teach a skill to a student, calm or comfort a student, to prevent the student's self-injurious behavior, and to escort a student safely from one area to another. These situations should be addressed in the student's IEP, 504 plan, or behavior intervention plan. Nevertheless, the restraint used must only include the amount of force necessary to protect the student from harm, provide for the student to navigate the school safely, and teach the requisite skill. For instance, in the last situation, the employee may need to use his or her hands to wrap the student's hands around a cup and bring the cup to the student's mouth to facilitate drinking. Finally, the Act authorizes the use of restraint in the event of the student's imminent destruction of school property. As with every situation described in this section, the use of force must be reasonable and directly proportionate to the actions being used by the student. For example, if a student were about to push over a desk, it would be highly inappropriate to tackle the student to the ground. Can anyone use a physical restraint to discipline a student? The answer is never. Physical restraint should never be used as punishment or discipline. The physical restraint of a student to address instructional problems, inappropriate behavior such as disrespect, or passive non-compliance with directions to finish an assignment is an illegal use of physical restraint of the student. The second type of restraint is mechanical restraint. A mechanical restraint uses a device or equipment to restrict a student's ability to move. The law defines a mechanical restraint as any device or material attached or adjacent to a student's body that restricts freedom of movement or normal access to any portion of the student's body and that the student cannot easily remove. For example, handcuffs, straitjackets, seat belts, or safety restraints are all considered mechanical restraints, but not all of these devices are appropriate to use with students by public school employees. Are mechanical restraints ever appropriate to use with students? Yes, but in extremely limited situations. Mechanical restraints may be appropriate when used as an assistive technology device, such as provided for in an IEP 504 plan or behavior intervention plan. These devices or mechanical supports are typically prescribed by a medical provider, physical therapist, or other appropriate service provider, and must be used only for the specific and approved purposes for which the devices were designed. An assistive technology device is equipment to help a child with special needs improve capabilities and skills and provide for proper body position and balance. For example, wheelchairs, upright standers, or Riften chairs are assistive technology devices that provide mechanical supports to students with certain disabilities to improve certain skills or to allow a student to participate and function more easily. Appropriate use of these mechanical devices must be pursuant to an IEP 504 plan or behavior plan. But remember, the appropriate use of assistive technology devices for one student who has been prescribed specific equipment for specific purposes does not authorize the use of that same equipment with another student unless specifically prescribed for that second student and determined by an IEP or 504 team. Although the law provides for additional circumstances when a mechanical restraint may be lawfully used, school employees should only use mechanical restraints as prescribed by a physician, physical therapist, or other qualified professional, and as determined by the IEP team or 504 team, which would include the parents and guardians. And, as with physical restraints, these plans should contain specific guidelines regarding the specific restraint to be used, its purpose, and the length of time that the restraint may be used with that child. All employees and service providers who work with a special needs student must be familiar with the use of mechanical restraints as specified in the IEP 504 plan and behavior plan to be able to implement the provisions of those plans consistently, appropriately, and with fidelity. In addition, seat belts, harnesses, or other safety restraints may be used during transportation. Can mechanical restraints ever be used solely to discipline a student? Never. Just as with physical restraints, mechanical restraints can never be used solely to discipline a child. Again, the use of physical or mechanical restraints solely for discipline would be an unlawful use of force against a student. This would include tying or taping a student's hands or body parts or belting a student to a chair. To briefly review, both physical and mechanical restraints can be used as outlined in an IEP 504 plan or behavior plan. Physical restraints can be used as reasonably needed for self-defense. Physical restraints can be used as reasonably needed to obtain possession of a weapon or dangerous object, and physical restraints can be used as reasonably needed to ensure the safety of others. Importantly, even when addressing a violent or threatening situation involving a student, every child deserves to be treated with dignity and to be free from abuse. Restraints must only be used to restrain the child as reasonably necessary to ensure safety and never solely for punishment. In addition, physical restraints can be used to teach a skill, and physical restraints can be used to calm or comfort a student, prevent a student from injuring him or herself, to escort a student safely from one area to another, or to prevent imminent destruction of property. The appropriate use of mechanical restraints is much more rare. Remember, mechanical restraints involve the use of a device or object, even a common product like tape or string, to restrain a student's movement. Use mechanical restraints only as outlined in IEPs, 504 plans, or behavior plans as assistive technology devices or as safety restraints necessary to secure students during transportation. The law governing restraints does not interfere with the use of restraints in cars or other vehicles during transportation. Remember, neither physical nor mechanical restraints can be used as routine disciplinary measures. It is unlawful to use restraint to either punish a child or to provide staff a break from that student. All right, let's move on to two other behavior management techniques: seclusion and isolation. Seclusion is the confinement of a student alone in an enclosed space from which the student is either physically prevented from leaving by locking hardware or other means, or the student is incapable of leaving due to physical or intellectual capacity. Seclusion, like restraints, is never to be used solely for disciplinary purposes. Also, the use of seclusion is limited by law to those specific situations listed in the statute. First, the seclusion may be used in the same circumstances that a physical restraint can be used. That is, as reasonably needed to respond to a student with a weapon or other dangerous object, to maintain order or break up a fight, or as reasonably needed for self-defense. If these situations occur, the law provides for the use of physical restraints or seclusion to maintain order and safety. Second, as with the use of restraints, the use of seclusion as a behavior management technique might be provided for in an IEP, 504 plan, or behavior plan. In those situations, school staff can use seclusion as a behavior management technique for that specific child. But there are specific guidelines that must be followed. Importantly, the space used for seclusion must be pre-approved for that specific use by Union County Public Schools. If seclusion is used with a student, the student must be constantly monitored by an adult in close proximity who can see and hear the student at all times. This means that all seclusion areas should have a window or some other way of allowing the staff member to observe the student for the duration of the seclusion. The seclusion space must be appropriately lighted, ventilated, heated, or cooled. The space must be free of objects that the student could use to harm self or others. And, as with restraints, the student must be released from seclusion as soon as the behaviors stop, or as stated in the IEP, behavior plan, or 504 plan. Again, seclusion cannot be used solely as a disciplinary measure. Isolation is also a behavior management technique when a student is placed alone in an enclosed space. However, when seclusion is used, the student is prevented from leaving, but when isolation is used, the student is not prevented from leaving, either through physical means or through the student's limitations. Because the student is not prevented from leaving, the law does not limit the situations when the technique of isolation can be used. However, there are restrictions as to how and where a student may be isolated. The Act places 4 limitations on a school's ability to use isolation as a behavior management technique for students. The student must be reasonably monitored while in isolation. School staff have the discretion to determine the reasonableness of the monitoring and may factor in the situation requiring the isolation and the needs of the student. For example, sending a student who is becoming upset to an empty room across the hall for a minute until the staff member can calmly talk to the student might be an appropriate use of isolation. The length of the isolation period must be reasonable in light of the purpose of isolating the student. The isolation space must be appropriately lighted, ventilated, heated, or cooled, and the isolation space must be free of objects that unreasonably expose the student or others to harm. Let's now discuss the behavior management technique that every teacher knows and has likely used in the classroom, going to timeout. Timeout is a behavior management technique in which a student is separated from other students for a limited period of time in a monitored setting. A timeout can occur in a classroom during class and can be called cool down, time to think, or other phrase that conveys to the student a temporary period away from the main activity of the class. Often the classroom has a designated area for timeout with a beanbag chair or other cues to identify this space as a cool-down place. The law does not limit or restrict the use of timeout to manage behaviors in a school setting. The last behavior technique addressed in the Act is the use of aversive procedures. The law is very clear. No school employee should ever use aversive procedures on a student. So what are aversive procedures? At minimum, they are unpleasant. At worst, they can cause pain, emotional trauma, or death. The law defines the concept as a systematic physical or sensory intervention program for modifying the behavior of a student with a disability that causes or reasonably may be expected to cause one or more of the following: significant physical harm such as tissue damage, physical illness, or death; serious foreseeable long-term psychological impairment; obvious repulsion on the part of observers who cannot reconcile such extreme procedures with an acceptable standard practice. As indicated by the examples provided in the statute, aversive procedures are techniques that could cause real physical or psychological harm to a child. For example, electric shock to the body, extremely loud noises, forceful introduction of foul substances to the mouth, eyes, ears, nose, or skin, placing the student in cold water or a shower, slapping, pinching, hitting, or pulling hair, blindfolding or other visual blocking, unreasonable withholding of meals, eating one's own vomit, denial of access to toileting facilities. Public school employees are never permitted to use any aversive procedures on any students. There are no exceptions to this rule. The use of any of these behavior management techniques on a student can trigger certain reporting and notice requirements. Remember, the Deborah Greenblatt Act is reprinted in student handbooks and distributed to students each school year. All employees have a legal obligation to notify the principal of certain incidents. There must be a report made to the principal any time an aversive procedure is used on a student. Remember, an aversive procedure is never to be used on a student. There must also be a report made to the principal any time there is the prohibited use of a mechanical restraint. Mechanical restraints should only be used in accordance with an IEP, 504 plan, or behavior plan. A report must be made anytime physical restraint is used that results in observable physical injury to the student. And a report must be made anytime that seclusion is not used in accordance with the Act, anytime seclusion of a student lasts longer than 10 minutes, and anytime that seclusion is used beyond the length of time specified in a student's behavior intervention plan. Anytime one of these events occurs, parents or guardians must be promptly notified. Promptly means the same day that the incident occurred, if at all possible, or not later than the end of the following workday. The principal or designee does not have to provide the initial notice to the parent in writing. A meeting or telephone call is perfectly acceptable. However, the school must follow up with a written report of the incident not later than 30 days after the incident occurred. The school's written incident report must include the date, time of day, location, duration, and description of the incident and interventions, the events that led up to the incident, the nature and extent of any injury to the student, and the name of a school employee the parent can contact regarding the incident. Finally, the law prohibits retaliation against an employee for reporting improper use of behavior management techniques unless the reporting employee knew or should have known that the report was false. So here are some of the top points regarding the permissible use of restraint, seclusion, and other behavior management techniques. Physical restraint is when an employee uses his or her own body to restrict the movement of all or part of a student's body. Mechanical restraint is when an object or equipment is used to restrict the movement of all or part of a student's body. Physical and mechanical restraints may be appropriate if specified in an IEP 504 plan or behavior intervention plan, and physical restraints may be used in those situations allowed by law. Restraints may never be used solely for discipline. Seclusion and isolation both involve placing a student alone in an enclosed, lit, ventilated space, but with seclusion, the student cannot freely leave, and with isolation, the student can freely leave. Seclusion may never be used solely for disciplinary purposes. Aversive procedures are never to be used with a student for any reason. And prompt reporting, not later than the next school day following the incident, must be made to the principal and the parent after the use of an aversive procedure, the unlawful use of a mechanical restraint, the use of physical restraint resulting in observable injury, the unlawful use of seclusion, and the use of seclusion for longer than 10 minutes or longer than the time frame specified in the student's IEP 504 plan or behavior plan. Thank you for your attention to the important matter of restraints and seclusion of students. If you have additional questions, please present any questions or concerns that you have to the Human Resources Department. Take this brief quiz to assess your understanding of the Act. You will be presented with a question, and the following slide will present the answer. Remember, the Act is reprinted in its entirety in all student handbooks. Every employee has the opportunity to review all of the important provisions of the North Carolina-Deborah Greenblatt Act at any time. The quiz is not audio recorded.